This is Tiffany Ann Cole. She was one of the youngest women on America's death row, but a twist of justice led to her death sentence being reverted to a life imprisonment. Tiffany did not kill her victims with a gun, a knife, a garrote, or any weapon you may think of. She had them bound with duct tapes. They were gagged, blindfolded, and then buried alive. They were fully conscious when they were hurled into the cold, lonely grave that swallowed them. But Tiffany and her accomplices watched them wail and suffocate as they mercilessly covered them with layers of soil. Tiffany, a woman they had helped, a woman they knew very well, had become their end. The key people in this story include Reggie and Carol Sumner, the victims, the 23-year-old Michael Jackson, Tiffany's boyfriend, 18-year-old Alan Wade, Michael's friend, 18-year-old Bruce Nixon, Wade's friend. But in the center of this brutal story was Tiffany Ann Cole.
But please remember that I didn't do this. I'm not the monster that created this, but I am sorry I met him.
Tiffany Ann Cole was born in South Carolina on December 3rd, 1981. Not much is recorded of her childhood, but she was a cheerleader, a Girl Scout, and played flute in the school band. The victims, Reggie and Carol Sumner, were high school sweethearts who parted ways after their graduation. While Reggie joined the Navy, Carol fell in love with another man and later got married to him. However, this marriage was marred by divorce. Following this divorce, she remarried, but this also was chaotic as the marriage was filled with violence as her husband became physically abusive, leading to her filing a restraining order against him. But as the couple's marriage troubles lingered, Carol's husband was not willing to let her go without a fight. So one day he came to her house and shot her 6 times. He intended to take her life. Neighbors called 911, and responders arrived just in time to take Carol to the hospital while the police went after her attacker. As they closed in on him, he pulled over by the roadside and shot himself in the head. In the hospital, doctors worked tirelessly to save Carol's life. She was transfused with several units of blood due to the excessive blood loss from the multiple gunshot wounds. Miraculously, she survived. It was years after this brutal attack in 2000 that Carol, who was then working at a cable television company, reconnected with her high school sweetheart, Reggie Sumner. Reggie had lived in Jacksonville for many years while working for CSX Railroad before being transferred to Charleston, South Carolina, where he retired, and later met Carol. Their love was rekindled, and on February 16, 2001, they were married. They found a place in Ladson, South Carolina, the same area where Tiffany's family lived, and the two families quickly became good neighbors. They saw Tiffany as one of their own and treated her very kindly. Even when Tiffany's father fell ill, the Sumners, without hesitation, helped her through any difficulty. To them, she was the daughter they never had. In March 2005, the couple decided to move from South Carolina to Jacksonville, Florida, where Reggie had bought a house during his days working for CSX Railroad. Before leaving, they sold one of their cars, Chevrolet Lumina, to Tiffany at a discounted price, allowing her to pay gradually just a few dollars every month, so she wouldn't be burdened. They showed her kindness, and perhaps in their hearts they wished she was their daughter. To the Sumners, Tiffany wasn't just a neighbor, she was family. They welcomed her into their home, told her to stay whenever she visited Jacksonville, and treated her like the daughter they never had. They felt safe with her, comfortable enough to share the details of their lives. But what they didn't realize was that they had let a predator into their home, one that was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. You see, sometimes our enemies aren't strangers lurking in the shadows. Sometimes they are the very people we trust with our deepest secrets. And for the Sumners, that trust would be their undoing. During one of her visits, the Sumners casually mentioned how much they had made from selling their home in South Carolina, a staggering $99,000. Did they overshare? Maybe. But in their minds, they had no reason to hold back. Tiffany was family. There was no way sharing this information could put them in danger. But that trust would cost them everything. That information planted a dangerous seed. A hunger. A jealousy so intense it could melt stones. Tiffany wanted that money, and she would stop at nothing to take it. Tiffany laughed with them, celebrated their gain, but deep inside a storm of rage brewed, so fierce it could set hell itself ablaze. She had made up her mind. She would take from the Sumners, and she wouldn't stop until she got everything she wanted. But to the Sumners, this money wasn't for luxury. It was their lifeline. Carol Sumner was battling liver cancer, a complication of the hepatitis C she had contracted after receiving a blood transfusion, following the gunshot wounds inflicted by her second husband. The chemotherapy drained her strength, while Reggie struggled with osteoporosis, a disease that had already left him with a broken leg, forcing him into a wheelchair. They needed this money to survive. Tiffany knew all of this. She saw their pain, and yet it meant nothing to her. There wasn't a flicker of sympathy, not even for the couple who had welcomed her like family. She didn't care about their suffering, only about what she could take. Now, this trip to Jacksonville when Tiffany visited the Sumners was made in June 2005. She did not go alone. She was with her boyfriend of 2 months, Michael Jackson. The pair had stayed in the Sumners' home that night. So, after the Sumners told her their profit from the sale of their house, she told her boyfriend, and the two started scheming how to take the money from the couple. Before leaving Jacksonville the next day, Tiffany and Michael paid a visit to one of Michael's friends, Alan Lindell Wade. They let him in on their plan to take everything from the Sumners. Wade, eager to make quick cash, wasted no time bringing in his own friend Bruce Nixon, who was just as willing to get involved. The idea was simple: rob the elderly couple clean, leave no traces, and if necessary, eliminate them. They wanted a crime so flawless that it could never be traced back to them. After briefly staying in Jacksonville, Tiffany and Michael returned to South Carolina, but their minds remained fixated on one thing: how to pull off the perfect crime. They spent the next few weeks plotting every detail, refining their plan to ensure there were no witnesses, no evidence, no way to get caught. Then, in early July, they returned to Jacksonville. But this time they weren't visiting. This time they came to take it all. They considered several ways they could carry out this crime without getting caught, but the plan they settled with was the most brutal of everything they considered. To carry this out, Nixon was tasked with getting 4 shovels. The car they used was rented by Cole, a Mazda RX-8 she got from a rental agency in South Carolina. They also purchased Nextel two-way radio phones and duct tapes. The next thing they needed to do was to find the best place where they would hide their victims. And so 2 days before they attacked the Sumners, on July 6, they drove around in the Mazda until they found a very isolated location outside the state of Florida. They entered Georgia. In this location, they dug a big hole using the shovels Nixon had stolen. The hole was 4 feet deep and 6 feet square. After they were done, they left the shovels in the hole and drove back to Jacksonville. 2 days later, on the night of July 8, they attacked the Sumners. The group drove up to their home where Wade and Nixon stepped out of the car and went and knocked on their door. When Mrs. Sumner answered the door, Wade pleaded that he needed to use the phone. Out of her kindness, she opened the door, but as soon as the two entered, Nixon brought out a prop gun and asked Mr. and Mrs. Sumner to enter their bedroom. Wade, on the other hand, tore the telephone lines from the wall. Once in the bedroom, they bound the couple with duct tapes. Using the two-way radio, they contacted Jackson. Jackson entered the house and began searching for valuables, especially their bank account records. After they were done ransacking their home, they took the couple to their garage and forced them into the trunk of their Lincoln Town Car. Using one of the two-way radios, they contacted Tiffany, who drove to the couple's residence to pick up Jackson in the Mazda, while Wade and Nixon drove the Lincoln Town Car with the couple still in the trunk to a gas station to refill it. Cole and Jackson followed them in the Mazda. They refilled the car and drove across the state line to Georgia, where they had dug a hole 2 days prior. Seeing the hole, Mr. and Mrs. Sumner knew something bad was about to happen. They gave them every information they asked for, including the PIN to their ATM card. After they were satisfied with the information they had gotten, they pushed them into the hole and started covering them with soil using the shovels they had left at the scene. They were conscious when they pushed them into that hole. They begged, cried, wailed, but these criminals were relentless. Mr. and Mrs. Sumner held each other in tight embrace as the soil swallowed them in that grave. Their crying turned to choking on the soil particles before it suffocated them. They lost their lives in that dark, cold grave. They covered the grave properly, made sure it was flat in order not to raise any suspicion should someone come across the site. From the site in Georgia where they buried the couple, they drove to Sanderson, Florida, where they wiped down the couple's Lincoln Town Car and abandoned it. Next, they drove to Jacksonville, where they found an ATM machine from which Jackson used the couple's ATM card to withdraw some money. Next, they found a motel where they would stay for the night, but they were not done yet. They needed to get every valuable thing they could from the Summers home, so they went and purchased gloves and returned to the victim's home. They took their computer, jewels, and others, which they later pawned. Let me introduce another character in this story, Rhonda Alford. Rhonda was Mrs. Carol Sumner's daughter from her previous marriage. You see, the Sumners were in poor health, and Rhonda used to speak with them every day. She always reached out to her mother to know how she was faring. But something strange happened between the night of July 8th and July 10th. No calls and no form of contact. She called, but their lines were not connecting. Rhonda was worried and reported to the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office that she had been unable to contact her mother and stepfather after several attempts. It was that same day that the couple's Lincoln was spotted in Sanderson, Florida, the same place the criminals had abandoned it. On July 12th, a seasoned detective from the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, Detective David Meacham, went to the couple's home to investigate. In their home, he saw a bank statement that showed a large sum of money in their bank account. He contacted the bank and learned that there had been an unusually large amount of ATM withdrawals from the victim's account. After this call, the bank temporarily blocked the account so that no more withdrawals could be made. But later that day, Detective Meacham learned that someone claiming to be Mr. Sumner had contacted the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. Detective Meacham returned the call. The person claiming to be Mr. Sumner asked Detective Meacham to help him in accessing his bank account. This impersonator was Jackson. They had run into problems not being able to withdraw any money from the couple's account. They initially contacted the bank and they were told that a hold was put on the account because of a complaint from the sheriff's office. This was why they called the sheriff's office. Jackson, acting as Mr. Sumner, explained that he had left Jacksonville quickly with his wife, Mrs. Sumner, to attend Mrs. Sumner's sister's funeral in Delaware. The detective asked if he could speak with Mrs. Sumner. Jackson handed the phone to Tiffany, who spoke with the detective claiming to be Mrs. Sumner. She explained how tired she was and how the quick travel had impacted her already fragile health condition, and that not being able to access their bank account was complicating everything. After this call, Detective Meacham contacted the bank and asked that the limitation on the account be lifted. But deep down in his gut, he knew he spoke with imposters. Since the detective suspected that he was not actually speaking to the Sumners, he contacted United States Marshal David Allred to help him track the cellular phone number the callers had used. Allred did his thing and came back with some information. First, the phone number was registered to a man named Michael Jackson. Secondly, the phone number had been used near Sumner's home on the night of July 8th. Thirdly, the phone number had made some calls to a South Carolina car rental company. With this insight, Detective Meacham contacted the car rental company, which indicated that it had rented a silver Mazda RX-8 to a woman called Tiffany Ann Cole, and that the car was overdue. Using the rental car global positioning system, the detective determined that the Mazda had been within blocks of the victim's home on the night of July 8th. As Detective Meacham and his team continued to tie things together, the criminals continued to make several withdrawals with the ATM card. These withdrawals were made by Jackson and Tiffany. Photo surveillance captured Jackson making several of these withdrawals. Tiffany drove Jackson to the ATM machines using the rented Mazda. The Mazda was also captured in some of the surveillance photographs. Detective Meacham reached out to Detective James Rowan of the North Charleston Police Department. Detective Rowan went to Tiffany's residence near Charleston, South Carolina, where he met Tiffany's brother David Duncan, who led Detective Rowan and other officers to the nearby Best Western Hotel, where Tiffany, Jackson, and Wade were staying. At the hotel, officers arrested the three before proceeding to get a search warrant to search the hotel rooms where they were staying. In the room where Tiffany and Jackson were staying, the officers found the victim's South Carolina driver licenses, credit cards, checkbook, mail, and papers indicating the victim's America Online account and passwords, social security numbers and birth dates, a photograph of the group celebrating in a limousine with champagne and hands full of cash. The victim's ATM card was found in Jackson's back pocket. In the room where Wade was staying, the police found a key ring that belonged to the victims. Nixon was later arrested. He was the one who showed the detectives the location where they had buried the victims alive. On July 16th, their bodies were exhumed. Dr. Anthony J. Clark, the medical examiner for the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, performed autopsies on the bodies and determined that both of the victims had died as a result of mechanical obstruction of the airways by dirt. This led to the conclusion that the victims were buried alive and asphyxiated from dirt particles smothering their airway passages. On October 19, 2007, the jury found Tiffany Ann Cole guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of kidnapping, and 2 counts of robbery. The jury voted 9-3 for her to receive the death penalty. 5 months later, a judge sentenced her to death. She was 26 at the time of her conviction. Wade and Jackson were also sentenced to death. Nixon, who led the police to the bodies and testified against the others, pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 55 years in prison. As of February 2015, Tiffany was the 3rd youngest woman on America's death row. But in 2017, the Florida Supreme Court ordered a new sentencing hearing for Tiffany, Wade, and Jackson because their juries had non-unanimously recommended the death penalty. This was done following a 2016 United States Supreme Court ruling in the case of Hurst v. Florida, where Florida's prior law permitting non-unanimous jury verdicts in death penalty cases was determined to have violated the Sixth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, prompting Florida to resentence more than 150 convicted felons under death sentences. In June 2022, Wade was resentenced to life in prison. In August 2023, Jackson was resentenced to death, and on August 23, 2023, after the jury voted 10-2, Tiffany was resentenced to life. Another twist to this story was that while on death row, Alan Wade fell in love and married Sigrid, a 39-year-old woman. She ended up having a child for him even though there were no conjugal visits allowed. Sigrid never revealed how she managed to fall pregnant with her husband behind bars. Even in states that allow conjugal visits, they are banned on death row. "We don't want to say how my son was conceived. I think it's important that we can sit and explain to my son how he was conceived before someone else does it for us," she said. "I like to respond that he's in prison, but I'm not. It was really hard, but we managed, and now we have a son," Sigrid said.
Restore